Okay. All right. So can Felicia hear us? Is she still there or is she gone?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi, Felicia. Good to see you again. Or not see you, as the case may be.
Just for a second.
Hey. Hey, good to see you. And Atilio is over there, and we have everybody in here. Okay. So you had the first lecture this week. No, wait. The first thing we're going to do this week is go back to the second part of the lecture last week, because we had 2 hours on speech acts, and now we're going to do a little bit on cooperative principle. And then we will go on to lecture 6, which is the SLA part of the politeness thing, okay? So, this was a week ago now that you did, or a week and a bit ago, that you did the cooperation principle. Make your conversational contribution such that it is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. So do you remember that you have the 4 maxims that make up the entire principle, right? Relevance, speak to the point. Quality, tell the truth. Quantity, say enough, not too much, not too little. And manner, be orderly, clear, okay? And I think Dr. Tado talked to you about how some people have tried to put everything under relevance, right? No, okay, never mind. Forget that. I didn't say that. Okay, but you did talk about the different ways in which you can violate, opt out, or flout maxims, correct? Okay, excellent. All right, so moving swiftly on to the EFL component of this. It's often noted that EFL textbooks avoid any discussion of implicature. Okay, they just don't want to go there. So they tend to teach the language as though it doesn't exist. There was one guy, Bouton, who you know, right, Sal?
Yes.
Yes, so...
I don't know if he's alive still.
I was going to say, he must be getting on if he's still alive. Yeah, where was he at?
He was at Urbana-Champaign until he retired in, let's see, 95, 96.
95, 96, so this is about right? So you see the 94. So basically, he pioneered this idea of looking at the cooperative principle in class and how it affected learners. So pretty much all the other studies that have come after him have used his materials in a lot of cases, in fact, in most cases. So he was the one that really said, look, how come we don't talk about implicature in all these materials? And how come we just leave it for, so that means that it's just individual teachers, right? If you want to deal with it, you deal with it. If you don't, you don't. So he wanted to know how that if you started teaching implicature, could you teach it to learners? Did they pick it up? So on and so forth. All these other studies that I've cited here are based on his original work, okay, Bouton's original work. So here's an example without implicature. Did you live in Tokyo for a long time? Yes, 5 years. Okay. With implicature, did you live in Tokyo for a long time? Yes, an eternity. Right? So do you see what's the implicature? Yeah. That Tokyo, she didn't really like living in Tokyo, right? Which is why she says, yeah, it felt like forever I was living in there, right? So what does the literature say about EFL learners and implicature? It says that cultural background is a predictor of non-native speaker ability to some extent. Like if there is a huge distance, a vast distance between your culture and the culture of the language that you are learning, then this can be more of a problem. Implicature can be more of a problem for you. A number of studies say that explicit instruction does improve learners' ability to interpret them, and we'll have a look at that in a second. And proficiency does play a role, okay? Because lower level learners rely more on background knowledge and keyword inferencing than contextual inferencing through implicature, right? Now, this is different from what we said before about sociopragmatic and pragmalinguistics, right? Because we said that you could have, that there wasn't a sort of a direct line between how good your sociopragmatics was and how good your pragmalinguistics was, right? But in this case, it does seem that implicature, if you're a learner, you're a low-level learner, you'll just go with sort of the obvious, you know, instead of any kind of interpretation. Thus, high proficiency learners outperformed lower proficiency learners. Lower proficiency learners focus mainly on bottom-up processing. Have you heard of bottom-up versus top-down? Is that something familiar to you? Okay, Naomi, good. Bottom-up means you process sort of sound by sound, word by word, okay? And top-down means that you consider all parts of the context, and that's how you're processing the language, right? So I'll give you an example. This is from Jenny Jenkins. She had a spot the difference task. So she had learners, each of them had a spot the difference. Do you know what a spot the difference is? Where you have a picture, learner A has one picture, learner B has another picture, and you have to decide what the differences are between. They're very similar pictures, but you have to try and work out, and it's a way to get learners to talk to each other and practice, right? So she has a picture, and in the pictures there's a red car, and one of the learners says to the other learner, "Do you have a let car?" Which sounded like let, L-E-T. Okay, and why would just a quick phonetics? Why would that be a perfectly reasonable wrong version of red?
Because for the pronunciation problems, maybe?
Yes, why? That's exactly correct, Attilio, but why would let and red sound so, you know, be something that low-level learners in pronunciation might make a mistake? What's the difference to it? Yeah, Attilio?
The sound is similar. It's almost identical just because for
yes.
one letter. We have the same ending, but one.
Right. So L and R are both liquids. We know that that's a problem for learners. Good. And T and D are the same, only voiced and voiceless, right? So it's not a particular. So the other learner says no, and you know they futz around for ages, and then finally they realize that the guy that said let means red, right? And you would think, looking at the context, that he would say, "Do you mean red?" Right? But instead what he says is, "Oh, I thought you said let, as in to let, so to rent." And it never occurred to him to look at the whole picture and say, maybe he means red, right? That is bottom-up processing. In other words, you just literally take the sound that you hear and say, I heard let, there is no car for hire in my picture, thus, you know, instead of being able to look at the whole thing and say, the phonetics didn't sound quite right, but maybe he means red, okay? And that would be more of a top-down processing. So low-level learners do a lot of bottom-up processing. They really try and hear the phonetic signal rather than think about contextual variables. And there's also a couple of study abroad experiences that say implicatures can be improved with routine expressions, but not with non-routine. And we'll have a look at what I mean by that in a second. So if you've got classroom learning, you've got teacher, materials, and other learners. So when it comes to pragmatics, you've got some problems potentially, right? That's the only materials you have. In most ESL, EFL textbooks, this doesn't even come up. Okay, remember we talked last week about indirect complaints. It just doesn't even come up, right? When I did the review of the textbooks, they just weren't even in there. Okay, so you've got that problem. In terms of classroom, we talked about constraints. For example, when you did your comprehension review, we talked about the constraints of having apologies inside the classroom, right? There's only one, set of apologies that you can do, person to person, right? You don't get any variation in these contextual variables. So there's a lack of awareness about norms, limit, and there's often a lack of direct or explicit feedback in the classroom about pragmatics, right? So Bouton was the one, as I said, that did these studies, that decided he wanted to see if you can teach it. So what he found was that it depended on the implicature itself. So some were easier for learners to understand than others. So here's an easy one. All the students got this. How about going for a walk? Isn't it raining out? Okay. So what's happening there?
Isn't it raining out is essentially saying no.
Right. Isn't it raining out is essentially saying, why would we probably don't want to do that because it's raining out. So it follows the CP, right? It's a flout. Excellent. I should have asked them that. Yeah, it's a flout, which means that even though it appears not to answer the question, it in fact is answering the question, right? So everybody got that, okay? And then a control group was taught what we call the Pope question implicature, which I think you did, right? So...
No, we discussed that last time we taught the class. Confusing it.
Oh, sorry. So, does Dr. Walker always give a test the day before vacation? B says, does the sun come up in the east? Okay. So that's called a Pope question implicature because the original one is the Pope Catholic, right? So in other words, it's so obvious. The answer is so obvious, that's the implicature, right? Yeah, he does always give a test the day before vacation. And then he also tested this, which he calls irony, which you can either agree with or not agree with, and Sal can talk about that if you're interested. Bill and Peter work together in the same office. They sometimes are sent on business trips together and are becoming good friends. They often have lunch together, and Peter has even invited Bill to have dinner with him and his wife at their home several times. Now, Peter's friends have told him that they saw Bill out dancing with Peter's wife recently while Peter was out of town on a business trip. On hearing this, Peter's comment is, Bill knows how to be a really good friend, doesn't he? What's the implicature there? Huh? Yeah. It could be all the way to what?
It's not the implicature.
What?
That is going overboard is the literal sense.
Yeah, okay. So the implicature is...
Bill is not a good friend. That's the
that's
implicature.
right.
That's the
Yeah, right. Because potentially he's in fact interested in Peter's wife, right? Which is bad. Okay. So in a similar study, Kim did out of these ones. These are the Pope implicature ones. So Frank is a big, this is what they were given. Frank is a big sports fan. Jim, did you see the game last week? Frank, is the Pope Catholic, right? So Jim says, did you see the game last week? Frank says, is the Pope Catholic? And then the learners get to pick what that means, all right? So A, Frank saw the game. B, Frank did not see the game. C, Frank wants to know if the Pope is Catholic. 4, Frank is more interested in religion than sports. Okay, so what's the answer to that one? A. Frank saw the game, right? So what they found was 72% of these 230 learners got it correct, but only 56% understood why it was correct. Okay, so when they asked the learners to give them a step-by-step explanation of how they got to A, these were some of the things that they got. Step 1, when people take part in the Pope's Catholic ceremony, they can feel it's too long or peaceful and boring. Because Frank is a big sports fan, he saw the game and was disappointed the game was boring, because being in a Catholic ceremony is boring. So you can see that even if they get it right, they completely misunderstand why they've got it right. Here's another one. Frank is a big sports fan. So Frank sees all the sports games if it's not prohibited. Frank thinks only Pope Catholic can prohibit seeing sports game, right? So it's interesting, right, that they got it right, but they don't know why they got it right. Okay, this is a study that was done in Egypt, and they did, in this model, they did a presentation of Grice, of the 4 maxims. Then they did interpretation of the implicatures in the model conversation that they had. And then they did group discussion and interactions. And this was 12 4-hour training sessions over 3 months. In this case, there was a significant improvement in working on these kinds of implicatures. And again, as we've seen before, found that high language proficiency facilitates ability in interpreting implicatures, which, again, it's that idea of top-down processing, that you can think more about what the message might be rather than just the literal message. And that pragmatic competence was correlated overall with language proficiency, which is not something we saw last week, in fact. So when they did these training sessions for these Egyptian students, this is the kind of training that they gave them. So on a pre-test, 3.8% of learners got this correct. Jose and Tanya are professors at a college, and they were talking about a student, Mark. Jose, how did you like Mark's term paper? Tanya, well, I thought it was well typed. Okay, what's the implicature there? Yeah, right. He liked it, he thought it was good. He thought it was important that the paper was well typed. He really had not read well enough to know he did not like it. Okay? And in fact, that's completely wrong. That should be she. Yeah, I just realized they've got a big typo there. Should be 3. It's she. She liked it. She thought it was good. She thought it was important. She really had not read it well enough to know. She did not like it. So the answer is D. So before these training, before the 12-hour training sessions, 3.8% got that correct, that the answer is D. And afterwards, after they'd done these training sessions on implicature, 88.9% of the respondents got it correct. Okay, so this was really to say, does explicit instruction help them do this? This is another similar one. Again, 3.8, this one to 81.5. At a recent party, there was a lot of singing and piano playing. At one point, Matt played the piano while Brian sang. Jill was not at the party, but her friend Linda was. Jill, what did Brian sing? Linda, I'm not sure, but Matt was playing yesterday. Okay, so which one of those? Would you say it was?
C.
Yeah, C would be sort of the literal, but what's It should be B. Right. So it was so bad that she had no idea what he was trying to sing, but it sure didn't go with what was going on the piano, right?
Why not A?
Well, because we're talking about the implicature, right? So it's not supposed to be the literal meaning of that's the whole point. The point is, can you understand what the implicature is as opposed to the literal meaning, right?
So A can be considered as a literal meaning, right?
That is correct.
Yes.
The person that says A assumes that Linda means literally, I wasn't paying attention to Brian, I was paying attention to Matt, right? And that's why I can tell you what Matt was doing, I don't know what Brian was doing. That's assuming that she means it literally. Now, however, we can make the implicature that what she's really saying is Matt was playing yesterday and Brian was singing yesterday very badly, so much so that it sounded like he was singing something else.
Right. Okay.
Now, where the problems are with the experimental setup is that C is perfectly good.
Right, which is what Diego said.
Well,
Yeah.
C, both C and B are perfectly fine because, yeah, they were not doing the same song. It was that bad. They were doing different songs, right? If I think that the lyrics of yesterday are something else or something.
Well, that previews, I think, my next point. Yes, it does. If you look at the second point here, a lot of this work is derivative. A lot of these tests are the same tests that Booton's used over and over and over again. People have just, rather than make up new ones, people have just used the same. So if there's problems with the test itself, like the problem that Dr. Hurtado just mentioned, then all we're doing is repeating the same problems over and over again. So there's not enough work. I mean, the handful of studies that I sort of briefly looked at here is basically it. That's what there is. 90% of it is based on these initial tests that Booton did. And as we've seen, some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But there are robust conclusions, meaning all the studies come up with a very similar overall sense, which is there is some relation between linguistic proficiency and your ability to understand implicature. And that in and of itself is probably related to the ability to see the overall picture. And there's also some specific suggestions on how it can be included. And that, for example, was here, where in this, they absolutely did in explicit instruction and changed the learner's ability to understand, okay? And that is that. So, questions or comments about this part? Yes, Amanda Kay.
If a teacher wanted to weave this in as some sort of bell ringer practice for ESL learners, are you saying that it would be hard to find literature to weave in, like for daily use in the classroom?
I mean, yes, in the sense that there's no ESL. I have yet to see an ESL or EFL textbook that includes this, even at high levels. I don't know, Attilio, have you seen this in any of your English textbooks? Explicit instruction of implicature?
Well, to be honest, to my knowledge, I've never had anything exposed in this way.
Right.
I'm talking about can be Cambridge tests, Cambridge books, all oriented to first certificate, basically, because all the huge amount of books we are having here are from Cambridge and Oxford, but basically are all exercises, limited pieces of grammar at all. So trust me, if I say that, as I said last week, we had no idea, teachers had no idea of what pragmatics means and how does it work. Literally, it's just a lot of amount of work we have to do through skill buildings, exercises, and keep on doing without any of this information.
Thank you, Attilio. Yes, so that would also be that's my sense of it too, having taught EFL for 20-something years, that it's not there. So if you want to do it, you have to find,
Your own. Which
you have
is
to
hard
find your
because
stuff.
even if you would ask me to come up with one of these examples on my own as a native speaker, I probably couldn't do it.
Yeah, well, I think, to be honest, that's one of the reasons why they keep using Butron stuff over and over again. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, yes and no, in the sense that the kind of stimuli, can you put back one of those where you have 4 answers?
Yeah.
That's because they're using a very specific kind of elicitation method, which is a multiple choice, right? Which has the advantage that it's very cheap, right? You can give a piece of paper to all the students, they cross one answer, they circle one answer, you count them, you've got your statistics, bingo, your study is done, right?
Yeah.
That's very nice. But that's not the only way that you can do this, right? So for example, you could sit down with each individual speaker and say, explain to me your reason, right? Now that is a far better way of assessing, right? That's what they did with the first study where they asked,
Yes, the step 1, step 2.
Right?
Yeah. How did you get?
But that's way more expensive in the sense that, if you have 20 subjects, it's going to take you at least, 10 minutes per subject. So now that's, in terms of time to do this, it's going to take a very long time, right? You could ask an open-ended questions, right? To try and tease out from what they tell you whether, you could question them, So there's all sorts of ways of getting at this, that doesn't have to be that kind of stimulus, which is very hard to create because you have to have discriminating sentences, right? I pointed out that one example that's not discriminating because 2 answers out of 4 are right? So it's a bad test item. The broader problem, and then I'll shut up, is that there is another consideration that, in a sense, makes this whole idea of teaching implicatures suspicious. The mechanisms to derive implicatures are universal. So they do not differ in Chinese, in Korean, in English, in French, whatever, right? So in other words, given a normally capable person, and given the correct background information, anyone can draw the implicature. You don't need to teach them how to draw the implicature. So what's happening here is, why are people failing? Because they're not familiar with the idiom, is the Pope Catholic.
Yeah.
It's an idiomatic thing, much like kick the bucket is an idiomatic thing, right? So that you're not really studying implicature. You're really studying the knowledge of some language game that's very idiomatic, that triggers implicatures that are standardized.
Yeah.
Okay?
So that actually goes back to, am I going this way? This part where Taguchi found that studying broad improved implicatures that relied on routine expressions. So in other words, if you go and somebody uses that as the Pope Catholic, and every time it's the same, learners will learn that eventually. And they learn that by being in that environment. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's
Well, so now, Amanda Kay, I have used, the materials that I use to do it is literature. I use a couple of different examples from a couple of different novels where there's a conversation between 2 characters, and I have the students try and work out what's going on in the conversation. And there's the literal meaning, you know, but in fact, the conversation between the two characters is about something else entirely. So, so that's how I do that, how I've done it in the past. But of course, then I don't test it, as Sal says. Then how do you sort of test that? You know, I mean, it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy if you do it any other way other than a multiple choice, right? But students, in my experience, high-level advanced students really enjoy it. They enjoy trying to understand what it is, because as Sal says, they understand that that's a function of language, right? So they enjoy trying to work out what that underlying message is.
Did I mention in my lecture the Watson example, the computer?
IBM.
Yeah, the IBM Watson, the example where Watson is working with this young woman in this office, and an obnoxious coworker comes by and says, "Hey, you know, are you going to the company picnic?" She says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, we have to do, 1,000 reports." And Watson says, "Oh, it's okay. With my, super capacity, I can do them in 10 minutes."
Right.
And then she says, "Well, we have some other thing to file." And Watson says, "Oh, but I can do that thing. I've already done them because I can correlate with my natural language skills." And the guy says, "Okay, well then I'll see you at the picnic. Great." And walks away, and she turns to Watson and says, "Watson, you gotta learn to take a hint." So I mean, that's a very good example where, you could say, "Can you explain what happened in this little skit?" Right? And now, obviously, you will need to explain, who's Watson, why is there a box that talks, But other than that, it's fairly straightforward.
I'll try and look up. This week I'll look up some a couple of the examples I used to use from novels and plays that you can have a look at, because they had a great time. The students really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and this is really good timing before a new school year is about to start, and it's always on my mind for the ESL students that I want them to be able to go above and beyond. If that's what you call top down, then that's what I want them to do.
Absolutely.
This kind of thing is not tested on their standardized
No.
test, so it's not in my TEKS that I need to teach them. However, I've been thinking a lot, like this summer, about how do I get more in there that's not stuff that I'm obligated to teach, just so that I can better their language instead of them just being like robots that repeat what's in my mandated curriculum.
That's perfect. I mean, that's also what Attilio is saying about his curriculum.
Yeah.
It's totally mandated. So yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll bring in a couple of examples next week just to show you that your kids might enjoy.
Yeah, because I also think it's really fun, like for them to try to pull it out, and it's not as straightforward as a lot of the other exercises we do.
Yeah, it's true. Diego.
Let's see if I can word this correctly. ESL is primarily for young children, right? Learning English as their second language. They can be adults as well. Okay. So with that said, then, does an age make a difference on an implicit person?
Yes.
Yes.
Like in the studies has
Okay, so let me divide that into two, and I'll let Dr. Hurtado talk about the age thing. Shame on me if I haven't made it clear right at the beginning of this course what the difference is between ESL and EFL, and I apologize. Okay, so ESL in this country means immigrants, so it can be adults or children or anybody. It just means I'm an immigrant into this country, right? EFL is exactly what Attilio is doing in Italy. So he's teaching English as a foreign language. They don't have any, and they don't come into, they're not learning as an immigrant in our, now they might go visit England or they might come visit here, but they're EFL learners. So, which is part of the problem, because if you're an ESL, like Attilio's kids or learners can probably get away with it because the kind of functions that they are using language for tend to be fairly sort of low, informational based, let's say. How do I get to the hotel? How do I, whatever. Whereas ESL learners who are dropped right in the middle of America, their needs are going to be much broader, to the point where Amanda Kay says, it's great if they can say where's the hotel, but they also need to do all these other things that you have to do with language. Yeah. Now age does.
Age makes a difference, and I can tell you for sure. For example, what was the example of the irony?
The irony was Bill and Peter, and Peter's wife.
So irony, there's very, very clear research that shows that, you have a...
This one.
Right. You have a climb, and so depending on the type of irony, so some types of irony, which would be this kind, where you take a positive statement and it means a negative statement. Children as young as 8 or 8 or 9 can process it, and otherwise it can. When you have instead a negative statement that means a positive, okay, then it takes like much older kids to process that, because it's much more complicated even for full grown adults. And then there's other types that are somewhere in between. So you really get, depending on the type of irony, they can be processed at an earlier age or at a later age. So, and because the process of irony is exactly the same inferential path that you would get for an implicature, logically you're going to have, depending on the implicatures, certain things that if you're teaching 7-year-olds, they may not understand it. They may not be able to process, for example, metaphorical meanings, figurative meanings, right? Yes, it may be that that's beyond the capacity of the learner to abstract.
Any other questions? All right. In that case, let's move on to lecture 6. So, lecture 5 that you all worked on already this week was Dr. Hurtado's lecture on politeness, correct?
Right.
And I'm hoping all of you had a chance to review that. Before we get started on the SLA part of it, second language acquisition part of it, does anyone have any questions for Dr. Hurtado about that lecture? Yes, Naomi, excellent.
I watched this a couple of hours ago, so I didn't have enough time to process all. About how universal is politeness.
Yeah.
I couldn't see exactly the difference between surface and deep politeness.
I'm sorry, you couldn't see what?
The difference between surface politeness and deep politeness, with the example of the say thank you. I couldn't see the difference exactly between these two. Surface
Yes.
and deep politeness.
All right. So the point that I was trying to get across there is.
Okay, sorry, either Felicia or Attilio, one of you is moving something around and it's making a really loud noise in the classroom.
Sorry.
That's
Thank you.
okay.
I'll tell you
Thank
why.
you.
I printed out the PowerPoint. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Right.
Just mute. All right, there you go.
Sorry.
Just mute the.
Excellent. Thanks,
job.
Attilio.
It ain't gonna happen again. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Hey, that's the least that can happen.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so the point that I was trying to get across there is that when we say, is politeness universal, it's a misleading question, okay? Because as usual, the answer is, well, it depends. What do you mean by politeness and what do you mean by universal, okay? So the example that I gave is thanking, okay? Now, what does thanking means. Okay? So let's say that I say, okay, can I have your phone? Can I have your phone?
Yeah.
Right? Thank you. Right? So she did something for me and I said, thank you. Right? So this is a behavior, right, where I ask for something, she does it, right? And so then I say, thank you, right? So instead of saying thank you, I could have gone, right? And, you know, if we had previously agreed that saying means I appreciate what you did, well, that's fine, okay? And if you think about it for 5 minutes, you'll find plenty of behaviors in which a nod is everything that you do to thank somebody, okay? So, for example, when you pass drivers on the road and you know they flash their lights to indicate that your lights are on, right, or that they're not on, right? What do? Do you roll down the window and say thank you? No, right? You wave and that's it, right? Or somebody does something nice to you while you're parking, you wave or you know you flash your lights. That's it. You don't shout thank you because well it wouldn't be practical, right? So, however, when you are waving with your hand or nodding or flashing your lights or whatever it is that you're doing, you're still thanking, right? So that's what I'm trying to distinguish here. Is on the one hand, you have at the deep level the behavior of showing gratitude when somebody does something that is advantageous to you, and that's thanking, right? And then you have then the surface thing, which is how do you thank people, right? So in the one image of the Dalai Lama, he does this gesture, which is sort of the Indian gesture for thank you that you have, as a matter of fact, on the cover of the Brown and Levinson Politeness book. I don't know who it is, but it's somebody who's doing this gesture, which, by the way, this gesture in Italy is prayer. This is how you pray to God. You put your hands like this and you pray. Okay, so if I go to Italy and I do this, they're like, "Well, Sal has become very religious." They don't think for a second that I am thanking them. Okay? Now, conversely, I need you here, Lucy, for a second. The other image that you have on the slides is the thank you handshake, right? That's a very no, you don't cover it. That's a power play. This is the thank you handshake. Now that's the Trump handshake, where then you hold on and you go like that. The Trump Macron handshake that made all the newspapers in the world. They're like, you know, yeah, but and that's really the thank you handshake where it's a regular handshake, right? But then you put your hand on top to indicate like I really feel this, right? And you know, as I told, I think I said that in the lecture. If not, I'm saying it now. I found that image by Googling thank you and gesture, and this is what came up. Right, and when the moment I saw it, I was like, yes, of course, that's exactly what this handshake means in Western society. So the gesture for thanking is different, surface politeness, but at the deep level, what we're conveying is I'm grateful to you, right? And that is identical, you know, and I'm guessing probably true in most cultures. That you show gratitude. When somebody does something good for you, you show gratitude. I mean, it is possible that then there's some culture where you don't react. Somebody does something good for you and you just say, all right, and walk away. All right, that's possible. So that would be a deep difference in politeness. Okay? So we have to distinguish surface differences in politeness, which is like, well, different gestures, and then deep differences in politeness, okay? Now, the deep differences is where it gets dangerous.
Yeah, that's where you get
okay?
trouble cross cultures.
Because if I do this, you're gonna be like, all right, well, who knows what he's doing, right? And you say, oh, he's thanking, right? But if I assume, and I use this example in the lecture, that bold imperative is okay among familiar people, right? I'm gonna say, bring me the computer. But if I have made that assumption wrong and my interlocutor is an American or Anglo-Saxon who thinks that bold imperatives are rude, familiar or non-familiar, then the person will be offended, okay? And then will not say, oh, Sal just used a different pragmatic politeness marker than I'm used to. Therefore, I'm assuming that what he really meant to say is, bring me the computer, please. The other person will say, Sal is evil and intended to upset me, and therefore they'll throw the computer. Okay?
But
So
notice how that is what we do with children in this country, and in Britain. I don't know how it works in yours, presumably the same. We say, what do you say?
yeah, you don't. So say,
Please.
can I have ice
Yeah,
cream?
can I have ice
And you
cream?
say, what do you say? Can I have ice cream, please? Okay, here's the ice cream. Right?
Yeah.
So
Right,
you're
yeah,
teaching
yeah.
the child.
So you're teaching that.
This is the
Yeah.
behavior that's expected in this environment. Okay.
Or,
So-
you give a kid, I gave my niece a present, and my sister's like, what do you say? It's like, at a certain age, she was like, and then my sister says, you say thank you. And then now, of course, if I give her something, she says thank you, But initially, when we started this whole business of me giving her presents, and my sister would say, what do you say? My niece actually looked genuinely confused when she was younger, like, I don't really know, what do I say? Okay.
Does that
Good.
answer
Excellent
the
question.
Yes.
Um,
But maybe at the beginning, if you are knowing a new culture, at the beginning you can maybe was confused about is that surface politeness or is a deep politeness, because at the beginning you don't realize about the system is completely different, right?
Yes.
May I hear never when you say thank you, so
Right.
I can feel okay.
That's very true, and I can
It is
give
very
you
true,
I can
yeah.
give you an example. I remember when I first came to this country, there was a sort of a game, a cruel game that we played, which was when new students would come from Europe, we would watch with enormous entertainment. Don't be offended, please. As the only Native American in the country.
Diego.
Oh, no, that's true. Sorry.
Near enough.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
Close enough. Well, sort of resident person who grew up in this country is what I'm trying to say. Because what would happen is that the Europeans would arrive, they would meet an American, and they would be like, "Wow, I've made a best friend," because they'd be like, "Oh, I'm so happy to meet you." So the Europeans were like, "Whoa, this is great." So the next day, the new best friend would be like, "Hi," and the Europeans would be devastated by this. I mean, I'm serious. Like they would come and say, "Oh my God, I thought but John, instead John thinks I'm they keep that one wouldn't even say hi to me this morning." And I was like, "Yeah, right. As I was saying, okay, let's walk through this. It's not that they're evil bastards. It's just that here, when you meet somebody for the first time, you say, 'Oh, I'm delighted to know you.' Okay? In Europe, you meet somebody for the first time, you say, 'Nice to meet you.' And that's even too nice. You say, 'Hello.' Talk to our town. That's
But
it.
you do smile.
Well, you smile, but that's about it. Okay? In this country, oh, I'm so happy to see you. We must
No, it
make
is
out,
true,
you know.
yeah.
It's
That's
way
the
more
stereotype, right? That's the
effusive.
American stereotype.
Yes.
It's all like, smoke and mirrors,
Oh my
loud
gosh,
noises.
then I would fit that to a T, but I also think that's like my personality, big time.
In your case, Amanda Kay, I
Well,
know.
that is true.
I mean,
That
that's
is
the
true.
nicest
Well, and of course, there is differences, right? I mean,
Right.
so in Europe, I am, not like a fun guy either, right? So,
This is in fact very true.
this is very true. So in this country, they're like, man, the guy is autistic, right? So well, I'm just saying. But I mean, so my point is that was exactly what you were saying. That is that you have this difference between deep and surface politeness,
Yeah.
and you don't know what's happening,
Yeah.
right? So again, the point that we're trying to make here is the foreign students, the European students who came in and were like, oh my God, what's happened here? Why yesterday so friendly and today totally, absolutely, completely uninterested. They didn't say, surely there is a difference in politeness that I am not parsing properly. They would say, the person that is a hypocrite.
Yeah.
And I hate
And again, that's the stereotype of Americans, that they're hypocrites, that they're really nice to you, but they don't really mean it. So, yeah. Good.
Right? So then those are examples of and of course, I mean, the thing is, you're not aware of it when it's happening. I mean, you're aware that something is deeply wrong, but you don't say, oh, clearly it's a pragmatic process, it's a politeness rule, whatever. Your reaction is emotional.
Yeah.
And this is called, I forget what it's called, the
Tacit.
the penalty.
Well, yeah, sort of. Yes, so he's talking about something called the linguistic penalty. And the linguistic penalty is essentially the, you just threw it out of nowhere. So now I'm like, how do I best explain the linguistic? Linguistic penalty basically is how non-native speakers can suffer through doing things that they don't realize are upsetting native speakers, okay? So the way that I've used the linguistic penalty is through intonation. So a non-native speaker might use a certain intonation pattern that for a native speaker sounds rude or aggressive. But the non-native speaker has no idea that they sound rude or aggressive, right?
And therefore,
so that's a linguistic, because what happens, let me finish now, I've started. What happens is
what have I done?
The native speaker doesn't understand what their reaction is. They don't say, oh, this is a non-native speaker who's probably using the wrong intonation pattern. What they say is, why is this person so aggressive and horrible? And that then can affect, so linguistic penalty really deals with inside a professional surrounding or what we would call a high-stakes situation. So this can then cost non-native speakers promotions, it can cost them raises, it can cost them their reputation, well, because people say, well, you don't want to talk to him because he's really aggressive. Okay, and that is what we mean by the linguistic penalty.
Something bad happened.
Something happened. Yeah. So good.
Is it just that it went to sleep?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Why were you talking about the linguistic penalty? I forget.
Well, because it's the same thing that's happening with the non-native speakers and the native speakers interacting. Because they don't say, oh, of course, he's just using a different convention.
Yeah.
They say he or she hates me, or he or she is a hypocrite, or he or she doesn't like me, or he or she is aggressive, or he or she whatever, right? They don't say, oh, of course it's another convention, this is what's happening. And so that's why you then pay the penalty.
Then you pay the penalty, yeah. And for a lot of non-native speakers, that penalty in high-stakes situation is a problem. And again, we come back to this idea of ESL and pragmatics. None of the materials, or very few, deal with high-stakes situations. You know, the exercise that we did last week, you know, which is a standard little pragmatics exercise for an ESL class, intermediate class, has no discussion of high-stakes situations or anything else. So we don't prepare them for this kind of issue.
Here's another example that I think is clarifies this. How do you address somebody who is your superior, right? So, for example, your teacher, right? Now, in some cultures, it's okay to address them by their first name, okay? In other cultures, that's an absolute no-no, okay? I love dealing with Italian students because they would not call me by my first name if their life depended on it.
That's true.
If they were like drowning and they could only remember our first name, they'd be like, it's okay, I'll drown. because they,
No, it is true, actually.
No, I mean,
That's been my experience.
you know, and it's actually hilarious, and Attilio is nodding. It's hilarious because they will call me professor, they will call me, you know, sir, anything, just to avoid having to make, because in Italian, you either say Salvatore, or you say Dr. Attardi, right? You don't have, and even when you choose the pronoun, you have to make the choice, okay? So you have to commit yourself either respectful or familiar. And familiar means disrespectful.
Right.
Okay? And so you have to commit to that, right? So then when you throw in cross-cultural things, right? The Americans walk into my office, hey, Sal, how's it going? And I'm like, all right, you know, that's minus 10 points, you know? No, I'm joking, yeah. But I mean,
No, but it is astonishing to me
Right.
how some American students will.
well, because they have no conception that you know, well, you know, you're dealing with somebody that comes from a different culture. You know, you might want to be careful about what you're saying there. You know, so and that's what I'm saying. That is, you know, in this case, it's a sort of a reverse penalty because the high stakes are in the opposite direction, right? But most of the time, the non-native speaker is in the low power position,
Yeah.
and the native speaker is in the high power position. In the case of the student addressing me, it's the other way around. Okay, but the dynamic is the same. You've got a power differential. Somebody's talking to somebody who's in a high power, and the linguistic choices that they make are going to damage them potentially.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Or shall we?
No, we don't have time for
Very
anything.
good.